Welcome to Edit Studio 30 Live. I'm John Dioso, editor of at Studio 30. According to the 2022 PwC Customer Loyalty Survey, companies that aren't focused on customer interaction face the terrifying fact that 55% of their customers are at risk of leaving tomorrow. Today's customers are empowered by choice, pressured by time, and expecting more and more from brand interactions. It's time to understand and invest in the elements that help drive customer interaction. Joining me today to share best practices for leveraging customer loyalty as a growth engine are Anjali Fehan, Marketing Transformation Director at PwC, and John Rolston, Marketing Transformation Partner at PwC. Anjali and John, welcome.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you all out there for joining us. Please let us know where you're tuning in from, and we'll give you a shout out later on. All right, let's get right into it. So the first question is for John. So John, PwC actually recently released the results of 2 customer loyalty surveys. I mentioned one in the introduction for 2022. What was the thinking behind doing both surveys?
Yeah, so a couple of reasons for launching both. One was a consumer survey. One was an executive survey. And we wanted to understand the nuances in terms of what were the perceptions and what drives loyalty. So from a consumer perspective, what actually drives their behavior? From an executive, what's the perception? Right. And we'll talk about it during the discussion today, but there's a couple nuances we found really interesting. Another reason is understanding post-COVID and now with some economic uncertainty, what are some of the drivers and how those shifted over time? That was another big reason for both surveys.
Excellent. And how big were the surveys, if you could share that information with the audience?
Yeah, so for the consumer survey, we had 4,000 respondents. For the executive, I think it was 500 to 1,000, if I remember correctly.
Nice. All right. And Anjali, what were the most important findings behind what customers said? Let's start with the customers.
Sure.
What customers said that drove loyalty to brands.
Yeah, well, and I think it was interesting when we actually look at both surveys together because there was a lot of overlap, and I know we'll talk about where there was disconnect as well. But the first thing was that loyalty is not going away, right? Loyalty is evolving, loyalty is changing. And I think we're seeing the rise of experiential, or what some people call emotional loyalty, like feeling connected to the brand. But executives are doubling down on that strategy and not just looking at it as a retention strategy, but as a growth engine as well. 65% of executives said that they were going to raise their budgets on their loyalty, and 55% said they're going to spend at least 5% of revenue on loyalty programs, really focusing on personalization and customer service. Some of the things that we noted from more on the consumer side was there's also a increasing lack of patience as it relates to bad experiences. So really wanting to have that consistently good experience across the board is critically important to the respondents. So 37% of the consumers said they were willing to leave a brand if they had a bad experience with that product or service.
And is that a significant difference from what customers were saying before the pandemic, say? Did we just become more impatient, or is that a result of just 20 years of the internet and everything else?
So we actually saw that newer consumers had even less patience. There was a lot more trial, right? Needs shifted very quickly. In COVID, people had different needs and abilities, right? And what they could do and what they could buy. And for new consumers, they were less likely to come back with one singular bad experience, where we saw people who had more tenure with that brand had a little bit more patience. It was still creating friction, but it wasn't as impatient, right, as a brand new consumer. So there was definitely a rise in how much people would tolerate. And it wasn't just an experience in one channel or another, it was across the board. So if my digital experience is great and you completely fall down in person or vice versa, that too is going to be a reason for me to leave the brand.
Were there any other ways? Oh, I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
No, I was going to say probably not unexpected, but demographic, especially around age, there was a number of nuances to Anjali's point around what drives loyalty amongst a younger consumer base. Certainly is around social community, ESG and some of those considerations very much are play. So that's something to consider as well.
What about programs that are meant to drive customer loyalty, things like subscription programs? What was the viewpoint of those?
We absolutely saw a rise in subscriptions. So, and I think all of us have seen that. We're probably all members of subscription programs, more than we actually even know at this point. But it was a great way for companies to think about a new model that allowed them to be stickier, right? It created a really great sense of convenience, which is one of the reasons why consumers said that almost more than half of them had at least one subscription service, right? And they said it's because it's so easy. right? It makes it so convenient for me. But allowed companies to retain consumers, allowed them to give them exposure potentially to other things. We look at some of the subscription boxes. It gave them opportunities to look at new brands or trial. So it's a really interesting model. I think what the concern now is going to be as people start getting fatigued.
And was there any difference, as John mentioned before, between generations? Is that also a generational thing, that younger generations are more willing to try newer products?
And they have more subscriptions.
And they have more subscriptions. Good to know. So what were the most surprising findings and discrepancies of the two studies? Anjali, why don't you take this first, then John, you can weigh in.
Yeah, one of them was just the definition of loyalty in the first place. So consumers have a more narrow version of what they consider loyalty. They consider it to say, I buy from you a lot, I participate in your program, or I might recommend you to a friend or family. Whereas companies look at it a little bit more broadly. Do you share your personal data with us? Do you have a subscription service with? Are you opted in to our emails or marketing or communication program? So just even how people are defining and measuring loyalty was different between the two audiences. It was also interesting that executives thought price was more meaningful than consumers did in terms of why you would leave a brand. So really only 17% of consumers said that if prices were to increase, I would leave the brand. But 37% of executives thought that was going to be the reason. Alternatively, it was actually the experience that consumers said was the number one reason that they would leave a brand, a bad experience with either customer service or the product itself. And only 26% of executives felt that way.
So people are willing to pay a premium price for a better experience. So premium brands, a lesson for marketers out there that it's not necessarily all. I mean, like with brands like Dollar General, anything where people are looking for budgets and savings, especially in these economic times. Often the things that really do drive that brand loyalty or the customer loyalty is something like a premium experience, and people are willing to pay a little bit extra for that.
That's absolutely true. But I wouldn't discount that price quality ratio. That still is the primary driver of what is going to drive purchase. People are still going to look at those two elements to make sure this is the quality product that I'm expecting for the price I'm paying. If those two things match up, then companies have a much better opportunity to differentiate with some of these other things like personalization, experience, and value-driven things like ESG.
Yeah, one thing I'd add on to that too is I think, as Anjali mentioned, companies are thinking a bit more broad. At the same time, we see loyalty start and end traditionally with the purchase. Whereas from a consumer standpoint, whether they say it or not, and I think some of the survey results indicated this, one of the biggest reasons for dropping out is a lack of high quality service at the end, right? So as you think about the entire consumer journey, as we think about loyalty, it doesn't just drive to purchase. It is making sure they feel supported, loved, cared, engaged throughout their entire journey.
Got it. All right. And if you're just joining us, this is Ad Age Studio 30 Live, and today we're discussing the secret to customer attraction. I'm John Dioso from Ad Age, and I'm joined by Anjali Fehan and John Ralston of PwC. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. So let's get back to the discussion. So, John, we often focus, and I think we're pretty guilty of this at Ad Age too, and not in the industry in general. We're very focused on B2C. We're all about that. Is loyalty limited to B2C, or did you actually see something in the studies that about that related to B2B brand or B2B relationships? What should they consider?
Yeah, no, this is absolutely very, very relevant to B2B as well. I know it's in its infancy in B2B, and B2C has been around 25 plus years from a loyalty construct, but very relevant. Traditionally, B2B has been more volume-based discount, rebates, all of those types of considerations to drive purchase. But we've worked with a number of B2B brands lately and did a recent survey. For a particular brand, it said 60% of their customers didn't feel truly engaged, didn't feel cared about, et cetera, and were willing to shift brands very easily. So I think that was telling, and that's true across a couple B2B brands. So extending that to experiential relationships, providing higher quality service, providing across the journey higher touch. I think all these pieces are still very much in play and came through the survey. And maybe not as top of mind for B2B, but for some of those leading brands, it very much is.
What's related when you talk about the experiential part of the relationship between in the B2B space? What's involved there? Is it similar? Is it just like you said, better customer service, better customer reaction? Is it having a better website and having
Yep.
better, all the above?
Yeah. So I'll just give you an example. We worked with a leading beverage brand recently on the B2B side, and working with their retail group to try and drive brand preference. And very much key to that was, yes, let's provide an incredible digital experience for the sales and service staff that are working with them. Let's make it feel like they're well known. A number of these retailers are small mom and pops. So how do we make sure they have a business to run? How do we make sure that they are supported? They can have a retail store that's outfitted and they feel really good about. So their entrepreneurial spirit, how do we bring that to life? So that was very key in that particular example, and we've seen that across industries and how you engage B2B customers.
Anjali, customers are increasingly basing their purchase decisions on company values, and we report on this practically every day. There's always another story. There's a beverage that maybe upset some of their customer base, or there's a cable news channel that ran into some difficulty. What did your study show?
Examples.
Yes. What did your study show regarding the relationship between customer loyalty and brand values?
Sure. So it's a really interesting discussion right now around value alignment, because we hear about all the time, as you're mentioning, right? And we have this world of cancel culture. But when push comes to shove, price and quality are still winning out as those primary drivers. Actually, only 4% of our respondents said that the primary driver of loyalty was around value alignment. So it's interesting that there's a lot of talk still, but as it's driving behavior, we're still seeing a delta between how much we're talking about it and what the action's really driving. That said, it's clearly in the consideration set, right? What we found was interesting, though, was that 4% that said it was a primary driver, that was almost consistent across all of the generations. And boomers actually were the ones most likely to leave a brand in order to boycott, protest, or because it wasn't aligned to some societal belief that they had. So it was really fascinating that they were actually more willing to walk and put their money where their mouth was, so to speak. That all being said, it's a clear opportunity for differentiation, right? But the importance is to really understand, what is it that has that value alignment between your consumer that you have to have, right? Not everybody, but who are you targeting? And how does that really align to the values of your organization? And the only way to do that is to have the data, right? Blanket statements like, oh, the younger generations care about the environment, or Gen Z cares about diversity. It's too broad, right? What about the environment? What about diversity? Who particularly are you targeting, and what are you calling them to do? And based off of that, what as an organization are you really willing to stand behind, and that's authentic to who you are, willing to maybe report on it or track it? And that's, I think, where the secret is. It's not just to say that we need to reflect the same values of our consumer base. Your consumer base is huge. You're never going to reflect all the values. You need to figure out what's most important to you as an organization, what's most important to those that you're trying to attract, and how do you create that engagement there. So I think it's still something that's definitely developing, but the companies that are going to be able to really use it as a lever to differentiate are the ones that are going to do it in a very smart way.
Yeah, and building on that, to Anjali hit on it, from a differentiation standpoint, it really connects with your consumers, your customers in new ways. And actually, there's a big piece to this, two pieces. One is the data value exchange. So if you provide that value, consumers and customers are more willing to provide their data, which you can use to engage them in a more relevant way. The other piece, too, as we talked about kicking off, this is a growth engine, but to make it a profitable growth engine as well. And going back to that B2B example I provided, was not only we were able to drive growth, but we were able to reduce the discount we're providing to create a higher perceived value through aligning on values to these consumers. So they would. So I think it's a big opportunity for all brands to consider.
Right. So the takeaway there, and also reflecting what Anjali was saying before, is that there is it's a significant minority, or they're a passionate minority of consumers that are very focused on brand, or making sure that whatever the brand values are, that aligns with their personal ones, mm-hmm. Right? And the follow-up question I wanted to have to that was, it really does matter about the brand, though. So you take a brand that's known for being environmental activist, or working in that area. Of course, one of the reasons why you buy that brand is because you align your values with that and you love that about that brand. But if you're a CPG brand that's just making some ketchup for example, you don't necessarily need that to be part of the value exchange or the brand relationship that a customer has with it. Is that what you found in the survey?
Absolutely. It's about picking your spots, right? You can't say everything. You've got to figure out what is the message that's really going to resonate with the audience that you're trying to attract. And as John mentioned, this extends to B2B, right? So it's not just B2C and personal alignment, it's also organizational alignment. So you look at ESG components and how companies have decided to report or commitments they have made. Well, that extends now to their supply chain. So how do you start programs that allow you to not only report on the good things you're doing in that, ESG space, but then also the vendors that you're using, what they're doing that contribute to the good that you're doing. So it's not just a B2C game. It's just figuring out what really is going to turn the dial for your organization and what does your audience also care about.
John, can we delve into some real world examples that illustrate the findings of the surveys? Are there any brands that have demonstrated best practices that our audience could follow?
Yeah, there's a few. From a categorical perspective, I think one of the things that, for instance, retail and quick service restaurants are doing, for instance, is around gamification and experience. So game boards around catering benefits more tailored to you and your personal preferences, and whether that's clothing or coffee or whatever made the way you want. I think that's very much in play. And then the other piece too that retail and is doing really well is around data monetization. So through this, you're collecting a lot of first party data, using that to the benefit of creating data monetization opportunities, advertising or otherwise. Travel, both airlines, hospitality are doing really well in terms of partnerships and creating an ecosystem and a lock-in effect. I think there's ways for other industries to take advantage of that and how you can use your points in a variety of ways or your benefits in a variety of ways just beyond the brand. With lifestyle overall, you hit on subscriptions. I think there's even retailers that are taking advantage of that now, and even other brands are taking advantage of subscriptions. So how can you create even a layered on top experience for your most high value customers to provide unique experience, exclusive access to them? And then, within the B2B space, I think it is truly those, the brands that stood out are those that truly show care above and beyond just a person being, a customer being a transaction.
I'm glad. Oh, go ahead, Anjali. Did you have something to say?
Yeah, no, I was just going to add on, we talked a little bit about that value alignment just a minute ago. And we saw in COVID and as other things were going on, Black Lives Matters or other societal issues, that some organizations really allowed you to kind of donate your points to different causes to stand behind, or started to even flag vendors or suppliers that had certain, minority owned or what have you. So there was a lot of trial, I think, and trying to give people flexibility. We saw that as one of the key things people want to say, hey, I want to earn rewards with you, but I want to figure out how I redeem them or what value they are to me. And I think that was a really interesting example that came out of being able to donate points, right? And being able to, the organization didn't necessarily say, we are donating these causes. We're going to give you the flexibility to donate to the causes that are important to you.
Can I pick up on one thing before we get to our final question? Yeah. Going back to this whole idea between understanding, aligning your values with between a brand and your consumer. I mentioned that one of the examples before. What was, now that you did the survey and you could see that in real time happening, what were the things that they did wrong? Because what they did was they alienated one large or a significant segment of their consumer base while trying to attract another one, or appealing to another part of their consumer base. So Anjali mentioned the data before. What did they ignore in their customer data that they should have seen?
I think it's a few things. I think one was not being authentic to maybe who they were as an organization. So people got on a bandwagon, whether that be in the environment, you can call it greenwashing, rainbow washing. There's a lot of terminology to say, I'm going to stand behind something in a moment in time to try to capitalize on a movement, a moment, a celebration, or what have you. But it's not necessarily authentic to who we've grown up as a brand or how we are behaving. I think other brands got caught up with putting statements out there, but then behind the scenes donating to causes or politicians or other things that went contrary to what they had said they stood behind, or an audience they were trying to attract. So I think in many cases, it was a disconnect of authenticity. You mentioned there's certain brands we know are just environmentally sound. That's how they've grown up. That's the stance they've always had. They're very consistent in their actions, and they're going to stay true to that base. I think it's the ones that try to latch on quickly to something that's trending without having the backup of authenticity is where people stumble.
Yeah, I think there's definitely that. And adding on to that is truly knowing who your consumers are. There's a brand that we've worked with, an apparel brand that is very well known in the ESG space. And they have a very solid product portfolio, but they started to extend their product portfolio in ways that, were in line with their brand values, but weren't necessarily in line with the consumer values. And those products weren't selling. They weren't able to drive people to those brands. So you can't be everything to everybody. You got to pin in on the audience that you're going to win with, and understanding their values is critical.
Great. Okay, now a final question I want to end with a little roundup. There's been a lot of disruption, as we've been talking about already, obviously, in the past few years with the pandemic. Now inflation, we see staff cuts, layoffs, everything, a lot of media organizations closing down. What are some ways that brands and marketers can better connect with customers and increase the odds of earning their loyalty, even during disruptive events? And I think we have a slide we want to bring up here.
Sure.
Who wants to take us?
I'll highlight and then John will jump in. I think there are a few things. The first one is what we're calling emotional loyalty or experiential loyalty, that it's important. John mentioned the entire journey before, but thinking through how you're engaging with that consumer before, during, after that purchase, all the touch points. Are you optimizing every way that you can really engage with that individual? And again, not forgetting the human element. This can't just be a digital strategy. It needs to be something where people feel connected and that is seamless throughout all the different channels. In order to really build on that, then investing in customer segmentation. Things have changed, and people are constantly changing. So making sure you're updating your analytical models, looking for ways to enrich your data, looking for ways to capture new data, and understanding that you can't be everything to everyone. So who do you want to zero in on, and how much can you learn about them is going to be critically important. That is going to be the input to a personalization strategy, right? That's going to be a data-driven strategy that allows you to maximize all of those touch points with your consumers and engage with them in the ways that they want to be engaged with. So John had mentioned kind of that data value exchange. This is where this happens. This is where you need to understand, what do you need to capture? Why do you want it? What are you going to do with that information? Is it going to be a key differentiator in how you're going to engage with these folks? And then be able to articulate that back to say transparently, hey, we'd love to know your birthday, your food allergies, your travel habits. Here's why. Here's the difference in the experience that we're going to give to you, and lay it out there. People are very aware that their data is being captured. People are aware about consent and privacy law and opting in and opting out. Give them a reason to stay opted in, and be able to really transparently and openly say, we are looking to not just get your data, we're looking to change your experience with us in a way that matters to you. I know we mentioned subscriptions here as the next one, but it's really test and learn with lots of models. Subscriptions became the new hot thing. I think people are really thinking about how to get stickier with clients, how to make sure they, getting month over month renewal revenue. But it's not just subscriptions. It's also changing up from points to rewards. It's surprise and delight. It's new partnerships, right? A co-branded credit card or a private label credit card. There are lots of different ways that you can think through how to update and adjust your loyalty program in ways that are going to be really resonating with your consumer base, but have a model that you can test, right? Don't just go all in. Test and try and learn and get the feedback from it, and then expand. And then finally, you have to be thinking ahead. A lot of what we've spoken about is existing consumer base, right? Know who your customer is and all of that. Know who your tomorrow's customer is too, because we work with a lot of brands right now that say we need to age down. And by the time you're typically saying that, you've missed the boat a little bit, right? So thinking about what are you going to start to offer and how are you going to start to engage with an audience that may be more diverse, that may be younger, that may be, have a different economic status, whatever it may be. How are you going to continue to feed your brand and engage with folks, even if it's that pre-purchase, as we're talking about on that journey? How do you start the conversation even before they're a customer?
John, any comments?
The only thing I'd say is back to the point on the business model. This, with subscriptions, this is an opportunity to create a platform of innovation, a platform of engaging customers in new ways and new revenue streams. So I think that that's key and something that's lost. Many people think of loyalty as a buy 9 get 1 free program, but ultimately it's a way to engage customers in new ways, capture first party data, and use that to engage them and drive revenue in new ways. So I think thinking more broadly around what loyalty is critical, and I think that one of the biggest platforms for winning with loyalty.
And final question I just want to add is, what was from the brand perspective, not the customer's perspective, but how did the brands feel about their ability to react to that last point about recognizing their new customers? Did they have the right tech stack? Did they have the right partners and all that stuff? Is there anxiety in the industry about the ability to turn quickly? Because as you mentioned, Anjali, if you're just thinking about that now, you're too late.
Yeah, I think there's challenges. I think technology is certainly one. And as you think about technology innovation with Web3 and Metaverse and ChatGPT, like this is very much accelerating in terms of how consumers want to engage with you. And there's a lot of brands that are behind, admittedly. And I think that's where some of the challenge and concern may be, as well as does our product portfolio and mix fit the needs of that younger generation, and how we engage. And Anjali and I were talking about influencers the other day, and how can we use influencers more effectively to drive loyalty. So I think there's a number of concerns that, but if well thought through and structured, and a strategy behind it, we have seen brands take advantage of that.
Well, that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for great discussion. Anjali Fayan from PwC and John Wilson also from PwC. I'm John Dioso from Ad Age Studio 30. Thank you guys. Thank you everybody for joining us today. See you next time.